Our first comment comes from António Costa Pinto, who is research professor at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon. He has been a visiting professor at Stanford University, Georgetown, a senior associate member at St. Anthony's College at Oxford, and a senior visiting fellow at Princeton University, the University of California, Berkeley, and the New York University. He is the author of The Nature of Fascism Revisited in 2012, and he co-edited recently with Federico Authoritarianism and Corporatism in Europe and Latin America, Crossing Borders. This keeps coming up. So thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this conference. I have on a personal note, I met Mosse for the first time when I was a graduate student at the European University Institute in Florence, so here in Italy, and there was a small group of Ph.D. students who used to go to every conference of Mosse in the 1980s in Italy. As a matter of fact, I think it was in the 1980s that Mosse became more close with the Italian historiography on fascism, was translated, and his influence became, I think, important in Southern Europe, not just in Italy, but also, for instance, in Spain, in Portugal, and other Southern European countries. And later on, it was a pleasure also to participate in one of the first, I think, conference of the Mosse Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So let me start with, not exactly with a comment, but with a statement. If in a few days, I don't know, a PhD student decided to listen to this, to our conference, as a matter of fact, he might be a bit confused with the uses of the concept of fascism in them. Because, as you know, in the last 3 days, fascism did float, in cultural terms, in political terms, in terms of regimes, in contemporary politics, in the 1930s, etc. And you might think, well, I'm a bit confused, but I think that is a very good thing. Why? I will. Because, in a way, the world, I would say the world, is facing new political challenges, and we need, as a matter of fact, to discuss much more, historians, social scientists, etc. What's the meaning of this contemporary new wave of associated with the radical right and fascism? And so conceptual creativity is, in this case, I think, a good thing. Being wannabe fascist, post-fascist, and many others. I don't like very much tables, but anyhow, to give you an idea, nowadays we can, of course, that's a good thing about online resources and digitalization, because it's very easy, for instance, to try to look at how the concept of fascism, for instance, is used or was used by the literature in the 1980s or 90s, etc. I remember in interventions I've quoted Paine as one of the authors that was very much quoted in the end of the 1980s. So when you look, for instance, at the academic literature on the extreme right, on neo-fascism, etc., it's very interesting because until basically the 1980s, neo-fascism is dominant because we are dealing with small, extreme right fascist movements, with the exception, of course, in Europe, with the exception of Il Movimento Sociale Italiano, that is a typical neo-fascist party, a successful party, as you know, and it was mentioned. But all the others, even France or Germany, when they are not illegalized, even because in some European democracies has this principle in the constitution that against the creation of fascist parties. So, but they're usually very small. They're small groups, and so neo-fascists must very much use it. From the 1980s till recently, very recently, academia was hesitating between extreme right and radical right. But radical right became the dominant concept in the literature. I don't have the figures for the last 5 or 6 years. But my intuition is that fascism came back, not just in the academic literature, but above all because we cannot control what political elites and society, what kind of concepts they use in terms of political polarization, etc., etc. And fascism is undoubtedly back. Even when we look at academics who are at the same time public intellectuals, let's avoid Paxton, who wrote an article, as you all know, because he's an historian, saying, well, maybe fascism, let's use fascism again. But Krugman, for instance, an economist who is also a public intellectual in the US, everybody knows who Paul Krugman is, and he used the concept of fascism, for instance, to classify Trump. So my point is, first of all, is that we do not control, as you can imagine, concepts like the concept of fascism that came back. To give you an example, another example, in certain European countries, the emergence of these radical right-wing parties was something new. And for instance, in Spain or in Portugal, of course, there was, in the case of France, was completely different, in the case of Italy as well. So there was a lot of statements by social scientists about these parties. And because they were at the same time, and I like it, quite frankly, as a left-wing social scientist, there was a lot of articles in the press using, again, the concept of fascism for these new parties, like Vox, for instance, in Spain, or Chega in Portugal, and in other countries, Brazil, for instance, with Bolsonaro, etc. So both in the intellectual arena, in the academic arena, we are facing a sort of a new conceptual creativity in terms of the uses of fascism and radical right and other concepts, neo-fascism, etc. And this is, in a way, a good thing, because we must admit that regardless, in terms of historians, less so, but political scientists, for instance, sociologists, we are, in a way, a bit surprised by this new global wave associated with the radical right. It's something new. We can, as historians, as usual, go to the past. And, for instance, there was a wonderful paper by, on, for instance, in quote, Casa Pound. And it's easy. Oh, Casa Pound. The good old fascist in 21st century Italy. Okay, it's nice, we recognize. But it's not because of Casa Pound that Meloni is in power in Italy. It's not related with the good old Casa Pound as in the past, for instance, the good old Movimento Sociale Italiano. And, of course, both Movimento Sociale Italiano and Casa Pound are a part of the history, but they don't explain, certainly, this new wave. So let me be very, very brief. First, we have different kinds of parties. If there is something that is quite clear when we relate historical fascism or fascism into a period with these new parties, we are dealing with completely different kinds of parties. These parties are not revolutionary parties, are not extra-parliamentarian parties. If we look at, even if they use, of course, elections, everybody knows this, both in Germany and Italy, but we are dealing with a different kind of parties, and they are becoming all over, mainly electoral parties. They like elections, they use elections, they use all the typical liberal democratic techniques and strategies, modern strategies to conquer, to win elections. In the US, this is particularly clear because, as you know, every single political scientist will tell you, it's very interesting because the U.S. democracy is probably the democracy in the Western world where we know almost everything about the attitudes of US society in terms of voting and electoral and political values. It's scrutinized all over. It's probably the democracy that put more money in pollsters. We know everything. I'm sorry, I was in Europe for instance, looking at the US elections. And I got the feeling that I knew almost everything. The vote of, Florida, Cuban Americans, African Americans, BBB. Everything was, there is thousands of pages about electoral attitudes of the US citizenship on elections. Less so in many other European democracies whose parties don't have enough money to do that kind of to scrutinize their relation with society and the electorate. So we are dealing, first of all, with electoral parties, and that makes a difference, as I hope I will not have time to develop. The second element I would like to stress that I think is very interesting when we compare the interwar period with this is that they do not have a gravity center or a diffusion center. What is the diffusion center of the current European Western radical right, or even not European Western radical right in Latin America, of Bolsonaro, of Trump, of Madame Le Pen, of Vox, of Chega in Portugal, of the usual German counterpart, or of Fratelli d'Italia or the Lega in the past. Is there a gravity center? Is there, compare with, for instance, with the interwar period where Italian fascism becomes an intellectual, political, and institutional gravity center for the entire world. If there is something good about comparative research, is that Japanese go to Italy. They don't come to Portugal. They don't come to Brazil. No, they go to Italy. Japanese, let us say, the conservative and radical right-wing Japanese think tanks, they go to Italy to look at corporatism, to look at the single party, Partito Nazionale Fascista, etc. Some of them go to Germany as well, but mainly in terms of social policy. Contrary to what we think, Nazi Germany is not a diffusion center in the era of fascism in the 1930s, but that's another topic and topics for another conference. When you look at the current global, let us say, wave, because it's a wave and it's global, we can think that Bolsonaro has nothing to do with Trump, or Madame Le Pen has a totally different kind of political origins. We know the father died a couple of days ago, as you probably know. So we do not have a gravity center. We might have in the future. There were some attempts, for instance, for one of the ideologues of the first Trump to organize a sort of a think tank in Europe, in Italy, as a matter of fact. But he is now out of the portrait and very suspicious, as you know, of Elon Musk. Anyhow, you know the name. He was in prison for a couple of months, and then he returned also a couple of months ago. Anyhow, so it is a global way, but what are the main topics of this global populist wave? We have basically one. Undoubtedly, it looks like, and we might compare it with the interwar period, but it's difficult. It's globalization and protectionist, nationalist reactions to globalization. But I think, and that's a point I would like to make, that radical right conservative values are let us say, the common denominator of all these movements. Why? Because when you look, for instance, at social policy, they're quite different from the strange Milei in Argentina, ultra-liberal, not liberal in the US sense, wants to impose the state and the central bank. And, for instance, Italy or Spain or Portugal or other in other countries where they associate this with the social policy and even state intervention in the economy. In terms of social policy, they're very different. But the common denominator seems clearly the association of a certain type of authoritarian liberalism with conservative values. Finally, we must deal with the problem that was, just to a certain extent, present in the interwar period, even by. We are facing electoral revolts against liberal democracy, against liberal institutions, against parliaments, against and this electoral revolt. That's why I think the concept of a thin ideology is very important, I think, to characterize the current wave. It's because, and that's a point I would like to stress very briefly, it's because, and the concept of populism is very important, as a matter of fact, I think. And maybe, if we forget the Russian populists, okay, in the early 19th century, I think we should look again to the literature, even to the Marxist literature of Latin Americanists, of Latin Americans dealing with Perón and Vargas. Because the current wave, at least, has a characteristic that every single sociologist and every single political scientist doing field research on that topic stress. The left, even the radical left, at least in the Western world and in Europe, lost the connection with, let's not call it working class, with the popular social groups of society. They lost the connection. They lost the connection in political terms. They lost the connection in terms of a network of associations. They lost the connections in terms of a strong union movement, etc. They lost that connection. And we must admit, when you look at, I know the cases, it's the obvious case of France. There are hundreds of studies of many of these parties, of course, are becoming catch-all parties. Of course, when Rassemblement National in France is more than 35% of the votes, of course it's not the working class or the popular class. It's a very important segment of French society in rural areas, in urban areas, etc., who vote for Rassemblement National. But we shouldn't. We should probably go back to some of this Marxists, because why? Why does Latin American Marxists was so worried about Vargas and about Perón? Because they stole us the working class. Come on, we were going to the revolution. We were socialists and communists, and these two guys, mobilized the working class against us, and they, in a way, institutionalized new kinds of political regimes, giving, in certain cases, even more social rights to, in the good old 1940s and 50s, the working class. It's difficult to define the working class, as you know, in states of stratification in contemporary survival. So, regardless of the different politics of the past, we know some of them talk about the Brazilian military dictatorship, but Bolsonaro was for 30 years in the minor conservative party in Brazil. Okay, he is a revisionist, supporting the good old memory of the military dictatorship, or more strictly neo-fascist legacies in the case of Italy, or does it explain the Swedish radical right was based on a small neo-Nazi party? Does that explain the 28% in the participation in a coalition government of the Swedish radical right-wing party? I have serious doubts about it. So to conclude, we should look to conclude. So the power, the only experience we have is Orban. I cannot develop this. To conclude, I think we should look again to what is very different of the previous fascist experience, and what was the common patrimony of interwar fascism and the interwar radical right, because it's this type of association in ideological terms that became very much present again in the Western societies. That's it.